When America needed a sword, she became one. The USS Enterprise cut through the Pacific swells like a blade through silk, her massive hull riding the waves with the confidence of a predator that had never known defeat. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942, she was more than a ship. She was America's answer to the rising sun. 34,000 tons of steel and determination racing toward a destiny that would reshape the war in the Pacific. Deep in the bowels of the great carrier, aviation machinists, mate first class Tommy Rodriguez felt the familiar vibration of the ship's engines through the deck plates beneath his feet. The rhythm was different today, more urgent, as if the Enterprise herself understood the magnitude of what lay ahead. He'd been working on the dauntless dive bombers since 300, checking every rivet, every wire, every component that might mean the difference between life and death for the pilots who would soon climb into these machines. The hangar deck was alive with purposeful motion, mechanics crawling over aircraft like ants on a hill, their hands moving with the precision that came from months of drilling, their eyes holding the focused intensity of men who knew that perfection was not an option but a necessity. Rodriguez, how's that SBD looking? Chief Petty Officer Mike Sullivan's voice carried the authority of 2 decades in the Navy, but Tommy could hear something else beneath it, the same tension that had been building in every man aboard since they'd received word of the Japanese fleet's approach. The dauntless dive bomber before them was more than an aircraft. It was a delivery system for American resolve, a flying manifestation of the industrial might that had built this ship and armed her with the finest pilots in the world. She's perfect, Chief. Every bolt tight, every system green. These birds are ready to hunt. Tommy's hands moved across the bomb bay with the reverence of a man handling sacred objects. Each 500-pound bomb represented months of labor in factories across America, the combined effort of millions of workers who would never see this moment, but whose sweat and steel had made it possible. The Enterprise was not just a ship. She was the sharp edge of a nation's will, and every man aboard her felt the weight of that responsibility. The hangar deck stretched away in both directions, a cathedral of American engineering filled with the instruments of war. 57 aircraft crowded the space, sleek Wildcat fighters with their stubby wings and pugnacious profiles, torpedo bombers with their long, graceful lines, and the dive bombers that would soon write their names in history. Each plane bore the scars of previous battles, patched bullet holes, replaced panels, the accumulated damage of a ship that had been fighting since Pearl Harbor. But they were ready, maintained by men who understood that their craftsmanship was measured not in accolades, but in the safe return of pilots who had become their brothers. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey stood on the bridge, his eyes scanning the horizon where the first hints of dawn were beginning to paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. As the Enterprise's air group commander, he carried the weight of 57 crews in his hands, 57 American lives that would soon be committed to a battle that could determine the fate of the Pacific War. The intelligence reports were clear. The Japanese fleet was out there, 4 aircraft carriers with their escorts, the most powerful naval force the Empire had ever assembled. Admiral Yamamoto himself had planned this operation, intending to draw the American fleet into a decisive battle that would end the war in the Pacific. What the Japanese didn't know was that the Americans were reading their mail. The codebreakers at Pearl Harbor had given Admiral Nimitz the greatest gift a commander could ask for, knowledge of the enemy's intentions. The Enterprise, along with her sisters Yorktown and Hornet, was racing toward a rendezvous with destiny, carrying with her the hopes of a nation still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor. This was America's chance to strike back, to prove that the sneak attack 7 months ago had wounded but not crippled the most powerful democracy on Earth. McCluskey felt the familiar weight of command, the burden that came with sending men into battle knowing that some would not return. But he also felt something else, pride in the ship beneath his feet, in the men who crewed her, in the aircraft that would soon launch from her deck. The Enterprise had earned her reputation through blood and courage from the Doolittle raid to the Coral Sea, and her crew had forged themselves into the finest fighting unit in the Pacific. They were ready for this moment, had been training for it since the day they'd first stepped aboard. When America needed a sword, she became one, and that sword was now pointed at the heart of the Japanese fleet. Below deck, the ship's crew moved with the fluid efficiency of men who had drilled these procedures until they became second nature. In the radio shack, operators monitored frequencies with the concentration of musicians listening for a single note in a symphony. In the engine rooms, machinists' mates tended boilers and turbines with the devotion of priests maintaining sacred fires. Every department, every division, every man aboard the Enterprise was part of a single organism, a living weapon system that had been honed by months of combat into something approaching perfection. The ship's doctor, Lieutenant Commander Frank Stevens, made his rounds through sick bay, checking supplies that he prayed he wouldn't need but knew he probably would. The wounded from previous battles had taught him that modern naval warfare was a brutal business, that the machines of war were no respecters of human flesh. But he had also learned that the men of the Enterprise possessed a resilience that seemed to transcend the merely human, a capacity for endurance and sacrifice that had already passed into legend. They would fight today not just for victory, but for each other, bound together by the invisible threads of shared danger and mutual dependence that transformed a crew into a brotherhood. As the sun climbed higher, the Enterprise's wake stretched behind her like a white scar on the dark Pacific, marking the passage of a ship that had become more than the sum of her parts. She was hope made manifest, democracy's answer to tyranny, the embodiment of a nation's determination to preserve the freedoms that had been purchased with blood and treasure. In a few hours, her aircraft would launch into the morning sky, carrying with them the prayers of millions and the weight of history itself. The Japanese fleet awaited, confident in their superiority, unaware that they were about to face not just American technology, but American spirit, forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the knowledge that freedom was worth any price. The flight deck of the USS Enterprise at dawn was a symphony of controlled chaos, a ballet of death performed by men who had transformed themselves into instruments of American vengeance. Aviation Ordnance Man Second Class Danny O'Brien watched the sun climb above the horizon as he made his final checks on the bomb loads, each 500-pound general-purpose bomb nestled in its shackles like a sleeping giant waiting to be awakened. The deck crew moved around him with the precision of a Swiss watch, every man knowing his role in the deadly choreography that would soon launch 57 aircraft into the Pacific sky. "Final weapons check complete, sir," O'Brien called out to Lieutenant J.G. Best, the dive bomber pilot, who would be flying this particular Dauntless into battle. Best nodded, his young face already showing the hard lines that came from months of combat flying. At 28, he was an old man by pilot standards, but his eyes held the confidence of someone who had looked death in the face and found it wanting. He had been flying from the Enterprise since before Pearl Harbor, had seen her grow from a green crew learning their trade to the finest fighting unit in the Pacific Fleet. The camaraderie among the pilots was something that civilians could never fully understand. These men lived together, flew together, fought together, and sometimes died together. They had shared the terror of night landings in heavy weather, the exhilaration of successful attacks, the grief of empty bunks when friends didn't return. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the air group, had forged them into more than a unit. They had become a family bound by the knowledge that their lives depended on each other's skill and courage. "Gentlemen," McCluskey addressed his pilots as they gathered for the final briefing, "today we have the chance to pay back the Japanese for Pearl Harbor. Intelligence indicates 4 enemy carriers approximately 200 miles northwest of our position. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet will go in first, followed by our torpedo planes, then the dive bombers. The Wildcats will provide escort and cover." His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had earned his position through combat, not politics. "Remember, we're not just fighting for victory today. We're fighting for every American who died at Pearl Harbor, for every sailor who's been killed in this war, for every family back home counting on us to bring democracy to the Pacific." The pilots nodded, their faces reflecting the grim determination that had become their trademark. They understood the odds. Japanese Zero fighters were faster and more maneuverable than their Wildcats. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was deadly accurate, and the enemy pilots were veterans of campaigns from China to the Dutch East Indies. But they also understood something the Japanese didn't, that free men fighting for their homes and families possessed a strength that no amount of training could instill. They were citizen soldiers, volunteers who had chosen to serve their country in its hour of greatest need. Ensign George Gay, one of the torpedo bomber pilots, felt the familiar mixture of fear and excitement that preceded every combat mission. The devastator torpedo bomber was obsolete by modern standards, slow and vulnerable. But it was what they had, and they would use it to the best of their ability. Gay had joined the Navy to see the world. He hadn't expected to help save it. But as he climbed into his aircraft, he felt the weight of responsibility that came with wearing the uniform of the United States Navy. The Enterprise was depending on him, America was depending on him, and he would not let them down. Below deck, the ship's crew maintained their vigilant watch. In the Combat Information Center, radar operators tracked the progress of the strike force as it formed up and headed toward the enemy fleet. Radiomen monitored communications, ready to relay orders or coordinate rescue operations. The Enterprise had become a floating city dedicated to a single purpose, projecting American power across the vast Pacific. Every man aboard her, from the admiral to the new seaman recruit, was part of a machine that had been designed and built to fight and win wars. Fire Control Technician First Class Joe Martinez stood at his station, monitoring the ship's defensive systems. The Enterprise might be launching an attack, but she was also potentially a target. Japanese submarines prowled these waters, and enemy aircraft might appear at any moment. Martinez had been at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, had seen what surprise attacks could do to unprepared ships. But the Enterprise was not unprepared. She was a fortress of steel and determination, protected by the finest radar and anti-aircraft systems in the world, crewed by men who had learned the hard lessons of modern warfare. The ship's executive officer, Commander Jim Rasmussen, moved through the ship with the easy confidence of a man who had spent his life at sea. He could feel the Enterprise's mood through the deck plates, could sense the anticipation that filled every compartment. The ship herself seemed eager for battle, as if she understood that this day would determine her place in history. She had been launched in 1936, a product of the naval treaties that had limited American naval construction, but she had been designed by men who understood that another war was coming. Her builders had given her the finest engines, the strongest hull, the most advanced systems available, and her crew had transformed her into something approaching perfection. In the enlisted men's quarters, Seaman First Class Bobby Thompson wrote a quick letter to his girlfriend in Kansas, knowing it might be his last. The mail wouldn't go out for days, but writing it gave him comfort, a connection to the world beyond the Enterprise's steel walls. He had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, driven by the same patriotic fervor that had filled recruiting stations across America. He had expected to serve his country. He hadn't expected to love his ship and his shipmates with an intensity that surprised him. The Enterprise had become his home, her crew his family, and he would defend both with his life if necessary. The ship's chaplain, Lieutenant Commander William McGuire, moved through the ship offering comfort and blessing to men about to face battle. He had served in the last war, had seen what modern weapons could do to human flesh, but he had also witnessed the courage and sacrifice that ordinary men could display when their cause was just. The Enterprise carried with her the prayers of millions of Americans, the hopes of a nation that had been attacked without warning, and now sought to defend itself and its allies. These men were not just sailors and aviators. They were the armed guardians of democracy, the defenders of a way of life that valued freedom above security and justice above order. As the morning sun climbed higher, the Enterprise's aircraft began their engines, the sound of 57 radial engines creating a thunder that could be heard for miles. The ship turned into the wind, her massive hull cutting through the swells with the grace of a creature born to the sea. On the bridge, Admiral Raymond Spruance watched preparations with the calm demeanor that had made him one of the Navy's most respected commanders. He had replaced Admiral Halsey at the last minute, but his quiet competence had quickly earned the respect of the Enterprise's crew. He understood that battles were won not by brilliant tactics, but by superior preparation, training, and morale, and the Enterprise possessed all three in abundance. The moment had arrived. The first aircraft began rolling down the flight deck, their engines roaring with the power of American industry. As each plane lifted off, It carried with it the hopes and prayers of 300 million Americans, the accumulated wisdom of a democratic society, and the determination of free men to remain free. The Enterprise had become more than a ship. She was a symbol of American resolve, a floating embodiment of the nation's will to fight. When America needed a sword, she became one, and that sword was now pointed at the heart of the Japanese fleet. The radio crackled with static and tension as the first reports filtered back to the Enterprise. Torpedo Squadron 8 going in, came the voice of Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leader of the Hornet's Torpedo Squadron. In the Combat Information Center, the assembled officers listened with the focused attention of men who understood that they were witnessing history in the making. The radar screens showed the geometric progression of the attack, small blips representing American aircraft converging on the larger masses that marked the Japanese fleet. Commander Wade McCluskey, circling high above the Pacific with his dive bombers, searched the endless expanse of blue water for any sign of the enemy. The intelligence reports had been specific: 4 Japanese carriers, their escorts, and the most powerful naval force the Empire had ever assembled. But the ocean was vast, and finding a fleet, even a large one, was like searching for a specific grain of sand on a beach. McCluskey's fuel gauges showed the relentless passage of time. Every minute spent searching was a minute less for the attack, a minute closer to the point where his aircraft would be committed to a one-way mission. Below in the Enterprise's radio shack, Chief Radioman Pete Kowalski monitored the tactical frequencies with the concentration of a man whose life depended on every word. The voices coming through his headphones told a story of courage and sacrifice that would echo through the ages. Torpedo Squadron 8 had found the enemy, but they were paying a terrible price. Theslo, obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers were being torn apart by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. One by one, the voices fell silent, until only Ensign George Gay remained, his aircraft shot down, but the pilot somehow surviving in the water, whispered Kowalski, his hand tightening on the radio. He had been listening to men die, American boys who had climbed into their aircraft that morning expecting to return to the Enterprise for lunch. The torpedo attack was a catastrophe, but it was also something else, a sacrifice that would not be in vain. The Japanese fighters had been drawn down to sea level, their fuel and ammunition depleted by the slaughter of the torpedo bombers. The dive bombers, circling high above, were about to inherit a sky swept clean of enemy fighters. McCluskey finally spotted the enemy fleet, a formation of ships that represented the cream of the Japanese Navy. 4 aircraft carriers steamed in a box formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. The sight was magnificent and terrifying. The Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, the ships that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, now vulnerable and exposed. McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio. Tally-ho! 4 enemy carriers, bearing 320 degrees, distance 12 miles. All dive bombers, prepare for attack. The response was immediate and coordinated. 37 Dauntless dive bombers, the finest aircraft of their type in the world, rolled over into their attack dives. The pilots had trained for this moment for months, practicing the precise timing and positioning that would allow them to penetrate the enemy's defenses and deliver their bombs with deadly accuracy. Each aircraft carried a single 500-pound bomb, but in the hands of skilled pilots, these bombs would prove more destructive than the largest naval gunfire. Lieutenant Best, leading the first section, felt the familiar sensation of gravity trying to tear him from his aircraft as he dove toward the Akagi. The Japanese flagship grew larger in his windscreen, her flight deck crowded with aircraft, her anti-aircraft guns beginning to track his approach. Best had made this dive hundreds of times in training, but never with Japanese fighters trying to kill him, never with the fate of the Pacific War hanging in the balance. He held his aircraft steady, ignoring the tracers that laced the air around him, waiting for the perfect moment to release his bomb. The mathematics of dive bombing were precise and unforgiving. Altitude, airspeed, angle of attack. Every variable had to be perfect, or the bomb would miss its target. Best's bomb sight showed the Akagi's flight deck centered in his crosshairs, the range closing rapidly. At 1,500 feet, he released his bomb and pulled out of his dive, feeling the G-forces press him into his seat as his aircraft climbed away from the target. Behind him, The 500-pound bomb fell toward the Akagi with the inevitability of fate itself. The explosion, when it came, was visible from 20 miles away. Best's bomb struck the Akagi's flight deck amidships, penetrating to the hangar deck below where armed and fueled aircraft waited for launch. The secondary explosions that followed were devastating, aviation gas and ammunition cooking off in a chain reaction that turned the pride of the Japanese Navy into a floating inferno. Within minutes, the ship that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor was burning from stern to stern, her crew fighting desperately to save their vessel. But the American attack was just beginning. The Kaga, steaming nearby, found herself under attack by Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's section. The Japanese carrier tried to maneuver, but she was too large and too slow to avoid the diving American bombers. 4 bombs struck her flight deck in rapid succession, each explosion adding to the conflagration that was consuming the ship. The Kaga's damage control teams, some of the finest in the world, found themselves overwhelmed by the magnitude of the destruction. In the Enterprise's Combat Information Center, the reports were creating a picture of unprecedented success. Akagi burning and listing, came one report. Kaga dead in the water, multiple fires, came another. The Japanese fleet, which had seemed invincible just hours before, was being systematically destroyed by American dive bombers. The pilots who had trained on the Enterprise's flight deck, who had lived and worked together for months, were proving that American democracy could produce warriors equal to any in the world. The 3rd Japanese carrier, the Soryu, tried to launch her fighters, but she was caught with her aircraft on deck, vulnerable and exposed. The American dive bombers fell on her like hawks on a field mouse, their bombs striking with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The Soryu's flight deck erupted in flame and smoke, her hangar deck becoming a death trap for the hundreds of sailors trapped below. The ship that had helped attack Pearl Harbor was now paying the price for that surprise attack, her crew discovering that American vengeance, when it came, was swift and terrible. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, leading the Enterprise's Wildcat fighters, watched the destruction with professional satisfaction. The Japanese had thought their carriers were invulnerable, protected by the finest fighters in the world. But the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 had drawn those fighters down to sea level, leaving the carriers exposed to attack. The torpedo bombers had died, but their sacrifice had created the opportunity that the dive bombers had exploited with deadly efficiency. Radio electrician First Class Mike Sullivan, monitoring communications from the Enterprise's radio shack, heard the voices of pilots calling in their bomb hits with the calm professionalism that marked the finest naval aviators. These men had spent months training for this moment, practicing their attacks until they could execute them in their sleep. Now, in the heat of battle, that training was paying dividends. The Japanese fleet was being destroyed by American pilots who had learned their trade on the Enterprise's flight deck. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, managed to launch a counterattack, her aircraft heading toward the American fleet. But she was alone now, her 3 sisters burning and sinking, her supporting vessels scattered and demoralized. The Hiryu's pilots were skilled and brave, but they were outnumbered and flying damaged aircraft. The American fleet, protected by radar and coordinated fighter cover, was ready for them. As the morning sun climbed higher, the Enterprise's aircraft began returning from their historic mission. The pilots who had left the ship hours earlier as part of an untested attack force were returning as the victors of the most decisive naval battle in American history. They had faced the finest naval force Japan could assemble and had destroyed it with a combination of skill, courage, and determination that would become legendary. The Enterprise herself had proven that American shipbuilding and American training could produce vessels and crews equal to any in the world. When democracy needed a sword, she had become one, and that sword had struck at the heart of Japanese naval power with devastating effect. The Battle of Midway was far from over, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The Japanese fleet was burning, and the tide of war in the Pacific had turned decisively in America's favor. The Enterprise's flight deck became a scene of controlled jubilation as the surviving dive bombers began their return. Aviation Ordnanceman Second Class Danny O'Brien watched each aircraft touch down with the relief of a man who had sent friends into battle and was now seeing them return. The dauntless dive bombers came aboard with empty bomb bays and stories that would be told for generations. Lieutenant Best's aircraft showed the scars of Japanese anti-aircraft fire, but Best himself was grinning with the satisfaction of a man who had just struck a blow for his country. "How'd we do, sir?" O'Brien asked as Best climbed down from his cockpit, his flight suit soaked with sweat and his hands still trembling from the adrenaline of combat. "We got them, Danny. We got them all." Best's voice carried the quiet satisfaction of a professional who had just completed the most important mission of his career. "The Akagi is burning, the Kaga is finished, and the Soryu won't see another sunrise. The bastards who hit Pearl Harbor are paying for it now." The news spread through the Enterprise like wildfire. In the engine rooms, machinists' mates cheered as they tended their boilers. In the radio shack, operators sent messages to Pearl Harbor that would electrify the Pacific Fleet. In the galley, cooks prepared meals with the satisfaction of men who knew they were feeding heroes. The Enterprise had become more than a ship. She was a floating piece of America, a democratic answer to imperial tyranny. And her crew had just proven that free men could fight and win against any enemy. Commander Wade McCluskey, the air group commander who had led the dive bombers to their historic victory, stood on the bridge beside Admiral Spruance, watching the controlled chaos of aircraft recovery operations. The success of the attack had exceeded their wildest expectations. 3 Japanese carriers were burning wrecks, their aircraft destroyed, their highly trained crews either dead or swimming in the Pacific. The Japanese fleet, which had seemed invincible just hours before, was now scattered and demoralized. "Outstanding work, Wade," Spruance said, his voice carrying the quiet approval of a man who understood the magnitude of what had just been accomplished. "Your pilots have just changed the course of the war in the Pacific." McCluskey nodded, but his thoughts were with the men who hadn't returned. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been virtually annihilated, their obsolete aircraft no match for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. They had drawn the enemy fighters down to sea level, creating the opportunity that the dive bombers had exploited with deadly efficiency. The torpedo pilots had died as heroes, and their sacrifice would be remembered as long as the Navy flew. In the Combat Information Center, the radar operators were tracking a new threat. The Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese carrier, had launched a counterattack against the American fleet. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters were heading toward the Enterprise, their pilots bent on revenge for the destruction of their fleet. The Americans had struck the first blow, but the battle was far from over. General quarters, all hands man your battle stations." The announcement echoed through the Enterprise's steel corridors, sending her crew racing to their assigned positions. The ship had been designed to take punishment as well as dish it out, and her crew had trained for this moment since the day they had first stepped aboard. The Enterprise was ready for whatever the Japanese could throw at her. Lieutenant Commander Frank McCrary, the ship's damage control officer, moved through the Enterprise's compartments with the calm efficiency of a man who had prepared for this moment his entire career. Damage control parties stood ready at their stations, equipped with the finest firefighting and repair equipment available. The Enterprise's builders had given her the strongest hull and the most advanced damage control systems in the world, and her crew had honed their skills through months of drilling and preparation. Fire Controlman First Class Joe Martinez stood at his station, his hands steady on the controls of the ship's 5-inch guns. The Enterprise's anti-aircraft defenses were formidable. Dozens of guns ranging from 5-inch dual-purpose mounts to 40mm Bofors guns to 20mm Oerlikon cannons. Every weapon was manned by sailors who had trained for this moment, who understood that their ship's survival depended on their skill and courage. The Japanese attack came in low and fast, their pilots skilled and determined. But they were facing a defense that had been designed and built specifically to defeat such attacks. The Enterprise's radar had detected them at long range, her fighter pilots were waiting at altitude, and her anti-aircraft guns were ready to fill the sky with steel. The Japanese had surprise on their side at Pearl Harbor, but they would find no such advantage here. The first Japanese aircraft to break through the fighter screen was met by a wall of anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky around the Enterprise into a deadly constellation of explosions and tracers. The ship's gunners, trained to mathematical precision, poured fire into the attacking aircraft with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. One Japanese dive bomber, its pilot wounded and his aircraft damaged, nevertheless pressed his attack with the fanatical determination that characterized the enemy's best pilots. The bomb struck the Enterprise's flight deck with a tremendous crash, penetrating to the hangar deck below and starting fires that threatened to spread throughout the ship. But the damage control teams were ready, their training and equipment proving equal to the challenge. Within minutes, the fires were under control, the damage isolated, and the Enterprise was preparing to resume flight operations. Damage report, called Commander Rasmussen from the bridge. Flight deck damaged but operational, sir. Hangar deck fire controlled. Casualties light. We can resume operations in 30 minutes, came the response from the damage control central. The Enterprise had been hurt, but she was far from finished. Her crew had proven that American shipbuilding and American training could produce vessels and sailors capable of taking punishment and continuing to fight. The ship herself seemed to possess a spirit that transcended her steel and machinery, a determination that reflected the democratic values she had been built to defend. As the Japanese attack force withdrew, having accomplished little beyond minor damage to the Enterprise, the American counterattack was already forming. The Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese carrier, had revealed her position by launching her aircraft. Now she would pay the price for her defiance. The Enterprise's dive bombers, rearmed and refueled, prepared for a second strike that would complete the destruction of the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Best, his aircraft patched and ready, prepared for his second mission of the day. The morning's success had been satisfying, but the job was not yet complete. The Hiryu still floated, her crew still fought, and her aircraft still posed a threat to American forces. Best and his fellow pilots would finish what they had started, would complete the destruction of the fleet that had attacked Pearl Harbor. "This one's for the boys from Torpedo 8, Best said as he climbed back into his cockpit. The sacrifice of the torpedo bomber pilots had made the morning's success possible, and their memory would inspire the afternoon's final strike. The Enterprise's pilots understood that they were fighting not just for victory, but for their fallen comrades, for their ship, and for the democratic values that had made America great. The second strike launched into the afternoon sky with the same precision and determination that had characterized the morning's attack. The Hiryu, isolated and alone, would soon join her sisters on the bottom of the Pacific. The Enterprise and her crew had proven that when America needed a sword, she could forge one from the finest steel and the bravest hearts. The Battle of Midway would be remembered as the turning point of the Pacific War, and the Enterprise would be remembered as the ship that had made that turning point possible. The afternoon sun painted the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson as the Enterprise's second strike force approached the Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese carrier. The ship floated alone on the vast ocean, her escort scattered, her aircraft either destroyed or desperately low on fuel. She was a magnificent vessel, one of the finest aircraft carriers ever built, but she was also a symbol of the imperial ambitions that had brought war to the Pacific. Now she would pay the price for Pearl Harbor, for the sneak attack that had awakened the sleeping giant of American democracy. Lieutenant Best, flying his second combat mission of the day, looked down at the Hiryu with the cold satisfaction of a man who had found his target. The Japanese carrier was trying to maneuver, her captain hoping to avoid the fate that had befallen his three sisters. But there was no escape from American vengeance, no sanctuary from the justice that had been 6 months in the making. The dive bombers of the Enterprise had come to finish what Pearl Harbor had started, to prove that attacks on American soil would not go unanswered. All dive bombers, this is Best. Target is the enemy carrier bearing 180 degrees, distance 8 miles. Attack formation, follow me down. Best's voice carried the calm authority of a man who had already proven himself in combat. The pilots who followed him into the attack were veterans now, tested by fire and forged into the finest naval aviators in the world. They had learned their trade on the Enterprise's flight deck, had practiced their attacks until they could execute them in their sleep, and now they were about to deliver the final blow to Japanese naval power in the Pacific. The Hiryu's anti-aircraft guns opened fire as the American dive bombers began their attack, filling the sky with bursting shells and tracers. But Japanese gunners were tired, their ammunition running low, their ship's damage control teams already stretched to the breaking point. The morning's battles had taken their toll on the entire Japanese fleet, and the Hiryu was fighting alone against an enemy that had tasted victory and wanted more. Best's bomb struck the Hiryu's flight deck with devastating effect, penetrating to the hangar deck and starting fires that would prove impossible to control. The Japanese carrier, which had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, was now burning from the same kind of precision bombing that had destroyed her sisters. The wheel of fate had turned full circle, and American justice was being served with compound interest. On the Enterprise's bridge, Admiral Spruance watched the destruction of the Japanese fleet with the satisfaction of a man who had just won the most decisive naval battle in American history. The 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were now burning wrecks, their aircraft destroyed, their highly trained crews either dead or swimming in the Pacific. The Japanese fleet, which had seemed invincible just hours before, was now scattered and demoralized, no longer capable of offensive operations. "Signal to all ships," Spruance ordered. "Well done. The Japanese fleet has been destroyed. The tide of war in the Pacific has turned in our favor." The message that went out from the Enterprise that afternoon would electrify the Pacific Fleet and send shockwaves through the Japanese high command. The Imperial Navy, which had not lost a major battle in over 300 years, had been decisively defeated by American carriers and American pilots. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered on the altar of American determination, and the Empire's dreams of Pacific had died with the burning carriers. In the Enterprise's engine rooms, Chief Machinist's mate Bob Patterson felt the ship's pulse through the deck plates and knew that history had been made. The Enterprise had proven herself to be more than a ship. She was a weapon of democracy, a floating piece of America that had carried the fight to the enemy and emerged victorious. Her engines had driven her across thousands of miles of ocean, her flight deck had launched the aircraft that changed the course of the war, and her crew had proven that free men could fight and win against any enemy. The radio shack was alive with messages of congratulation from across the Pacific Fleet. Pearl Harbor, still scarred from the December attack, sent word that the Japanese fleet had been avenged. The West Coast, which had lived in fear of invasion, breathed easier knowing that the Japanese Navy was no longer capable of such operations. The Enterprise had become the sword of American democracy, and that sword had struck deep into the heart of Japanese naval power. Aviation Ordnance Man Second Class Danny O'Brien stood on the flight deck as the victorious pilots returned from their final mission. The dauntless dive bombers came aboard with empty bomb bays and tales of destruction that would be told for generations. The Japanese fleet was finished, its carriers burning, its aircraft destroyed, its highly trained air crews either dead or swimming in the Pacific. The Enterprise and her crew had accomplished what many had thought impossible. They had decisively defeated the Imperial Japanese Navy in open battle. As the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, the Enterprise's crew began to comprehend the magnitude of what they had accomplished. In a single day, they had destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of the Empire's finest naval aviators. The Battle of Midway would be remembered as the turning point of the Pacific War, the moment when American industrial might and democratic values proved superior to Japanese militarism and imperial ambition. The Enterprise herself had proven to hold more than the sum of her parts. She was 34,000 tons of American steel and determination, a floating manifestation of the industrial might that had built the world's most powerful democracy. Her crew had forged themselves into something approaching perfection, not through the blind obedience of totalitarian systems, but through the voluntary cooperation of free men united in a common cause. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, exhausted but triumphant, stood on the bridge as the last of his aircraft returned from the final strike. The Hiryu was burning on the horizon, her magazines exploding in spectacular fountains of flame and smoke. The Japanese carrier would not see another dawn, would not launch another attack, would not threaten another American city. The fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor was now scattered across the bottom of the Pacific, a monument to the folly of attacking the United States of America. "Sir," reported the air operations officer, "all aircraft recovered." Final damage assessment indicates 4 enemy carriers destroyed, multiple cruisers and destroyers damaged. Our losses: minimal aircraft, light personnel casualties. The Japanese fleet is finished. McCluskey nodded, but his thoughts were with the men who had not returned. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been virtually annihilated in the morning's attack. Solid aircraft, no match for Japanese fighters, and anti-aircraft fire. But their sacrifice had created the opportunity that the dive bombers had exploited with deadly efficiency. The torpedo pilots had died as heroes, and their memory would be honored as long as the Navy flew. In the enlisted men's quarters, Seaman First Class Bobby Thompson finished his letter to his girlfriend in Kansas, his hands still shaking from the day's excitement. The Enterprise had proven herself to be more than a ship. She was a home, a family, a way of life worth fighting for. The crew had endured months of training, weeks of tedious patrol duty, and hours of mortal terror, but they had emerged victorious. They had proven that democracy could produce warriors equal to any in the world. The ship's chaplain, Lieutenant Commander William McGuire, moved through the Enterprise's compartments, offering comfort to the wounded and prayers of thanksgiving for the victory. The day had been costly. American boys had died in the service of their country, and their sacrifice would not be forgotten. But their deaths had not been in vain. They had helped to turn the tide of war in the Pacific, had helped to preserve the freedoms that made America great. As night fell over the Pacific, the Enterprise continued her patrol, her radar searching for any remaining Japanese forces. The great carrier had proven herself to be the finest fighting ship in the world, crewed by men who understood that freedom was not free, that democracy had to be defended by force of arms. The Japanese had thought they could strike America and escape retaliation, but they had discovered that the sleeping giant had awakened, and his anger was terrible to behold. The Battle of Midway was over, but the war in the Pacific was just beginning. The Enterprise and her crew had proven that American shipbuilding and American training could produce vessels and sailors capable of defeating any enemy. The ship had become more than a weapon. She was a symbol of American resolve, a floating piece of the homeland that carried the fight to the enemy wherever they might be found. In the months and years that followed, the Enterprise would continue to serve with distinction, her aircraft striking targets from the Solomons to the Philippines, her crew writing new chapters in the annals of naval warfare. But June 4, 1942, would always be remembered as her finest hour, the day when she had helped to turn the tide of war in the Pacific. The Japanese fleet that had attacked Pearl Harbor was now resting on the bottom of the Pacific, and American democracy had proven itself capable of defending its values against any threat. The Enterprise herself had become a legend, her name spoken with reverence in every naval base and shipyard in America. She was more than a ship. She was the embodiment of American industrial might, the product of a free society that could mobilize its resources and its people in defense of liberty. When America needed a sword, she had become one, and that sword had struck deep into the heart of Japanese naval power. As the great carrier steamed through the Pacific night, her crew knew that they had witnessed history in the making. The Enterprise had proven that democratic values and American ingenuity could triumph over militarism and imperialism. The ship and her crew had become instruments of American foreign policy, the sharp edge of a nation's will to remain free. The Japanese had learned that attacks on American soil would not go unanswered, that the United States possessed both the will and the means to defend itself and its allies. The Enterprise's victory at Midway had proven that, when America needed a sword, she could forge one from the finest steel and the bravest hearts. The ship had become more than a weapon. She was a symbol of everything that made America great, a floating piece of the homeland that carried the fight to the enemy wherever they might be found. The crew had proven that free men, fighting for their homes and families, possessed a strength that no amount of training could instill in the soldiers of totalitarian regimes. The Battle of Midway had been won, but the lessons learned aboard the Enterprise would echo through the ages. Democracy had proven itself capable of producing warriors equal to any in the world, and American industrial might had shown that it could build weapons capable of defeating any enemy. The Enterprise and her crew had written their names in the annals of naval warfare. and their victory would be remembered as long as free men valued liberty above life itself. When the final accounting was made, the Enterprise had proven herself to be more than the sum of her parts. She was 34,000 tons of American steel and determination, but she was also something more. She was the embodiment of the American spirit, the product of a free society that valued individual liberty and democratic governance. Her crew had proven that such values, when threatened, could produce a response that was swift, decisive, and utterly devastating to those who would challenge them. The Enterprise had become America's sword, and that sword had struck true. The Japanese fleet was destroyed, the tide of war had turned, and the world had learned that democracy, when aroused, was the most powerful force on Earth. The great carrier and her crew had proven that when America needed heroes, she could produce them from the ranks of ordinary citizens who possessed extraordinary courage. The Battle of Midway was over, but the legend of the Enterprise had just begun.